morning, everybody. Welcome to the Planning Committee. With me on the committee is Council Members Dan Hamill and April Barker. This is the third work session on affordable housing for the Planning Committee and has two parts. The first part is a brief presentation by the Planning Community Development staff on the evolution of zoning in Bellingham and how that has evolved over time to meet the changing needs and interests of our community. The second part is a conversation on the non-subsidized affordable housing offered by mobile home parks in Bellingham. The committee has invited a national expert on the topic, Isabel Dickens. She has assisted homeowners associations in purchasing their communities in residential-owned cooperatives, and she is involved in policy changes at the local level, state and federal levels to preserve and protect manufacturing, homeowners' rights, and housing choice. We will also have a 15-minute comment period at about 11:15, so we'll begin with Mr. Sepler.
Council members, I've been asked to give a short overview of the last 60 years of zoning in America in 30 minutes. The 30s will be very quick.
Okay.
We'll speed it up and get right to the things of substance. In general, zoning is a system that's applied that determines uses that are allowed conditionally, or prohibited within an area. By its nature, it determines where you can build and what the intent and intensity of those activities can be. And we're fairly familiar with it in the sense that it has a series of uses, height limitations, bulk and dimensional limitations, and special regulations that are largely intended to prevent those incompatible uses from being established next to each other, and to encourage the development of desirable uses based on community intent. In looking at zoning, its basis really comes from two key concepts. The first is to regulate land uses to avoid nuisance. Nuisance is the issue where you would have an adverse activity and the effect that the adjacency would have. And in doing that in zoning, you're trying to find a system that allows compatible uses to be together and provides for transition or for adjustment of sorts or regulation to prevent incompatible uses. It also is based entirely on police power, and that is to proactively avoid those actions and activities that cause harm. And it really is geared to preserve the welfare of the whole community. So on the left is Euclid. He's the preeminent mathematician of the Greco-Roman period, lived about 300 BC. We know him for his treatise on geometry. It was called Elements. And on the right is Euclid, Ohio. The only thing they share is their name. Folks hear Euclidean zoning and they think it has something to do with geometry. Absolutely not. It really has more to do with the town of Euclid, Ohio, because it was in Euclid, Ohio that they were not the first to establish zoning, nor were they first to be tested in the courts about zoning, but they were the first to get in front of the Supreme Court of the United States with zoning. And in the Euclid v. Ambler Realty, a really foundational case for land use zoning, they affirm the right of a community to set rules, set designation and establish zones to protect public health, safety, and welfare, to avoid nuisance. So Euclidean zoning really is more about the town of Euclid and their first validation of zoning. So in looking at the policy basis for zoning, I guess there are three threads we want to bring to your attention. Some would talk always about the example of the factory next to the house, that when zoning was first established, the key aspect of it was to prevent those dissimilar uses from going forward, and that's the example most used. Should be noted that strong property rights advocates were additional advocates of zoning. They really felt that you should have some protection against adjacencies in what they did and how it would move forward. The second is that there is a strong thread of preserving both the financial viability and predictability of development. In essence, if you know what's allowed, you can make reasonable plans, you can have reasonable expectations, and we can achieve those ends of protecting the public health, safety, and welfare and avoiding nuisance. There are some challenges that are inherent in the strict application of zoning. In general, it basically concentrates by its nature through exclusion areas of poverty, and in doing so, the only aspect that it preserves is prolonging poverty. And that has a lot to do, a good example are the cases they went forward, were taken up through the courts. They're known as the Mount Laurel decisions. Mount Laurel was a very affluent suburb. There was no zoning for anyone who wasn't affluent, although a number of people who were not affluent lived in the town. And the remedy for that was that you needed to provide a range of housing options within your community, your fair share of housing options to accommodate a diversity of incomes and go forward on that basis. So we always look towards that. Zoning predictably just can't exclude, it has to be inclusive, and you need to find a balanced approach in your community. So Bellingham, like the state, has seen an evolution of zoning over time. In the state of Washington, zoning is one where in 1959 the WACs were amended to allow for the statewide application of zoning. That the first city maps, both here and in other cities in Western Washington across the state, became apparent in the 60s. Zoning was intended to implement the comprehensive plan, and many of the plans that were adopted by communities, there was a great deal in the 60s of funding available to have communities do comprehensive plans. But up until 1990, that comprehensive plan and your zoning had no relationship by law. In essence, you could have a plan that talked about the way your future growth should be, and you could have a zoning code, and you could look at two different maps, and they wouldn't match. Somewhat disconcerting when you're trying to talk about the future goals and aspirations of a community, and we have a system in place that didn't reflect it. Since the adoption of the Growth Management Act in 1990, zoning must fully implement the comprehensive plan. And the zoning regulations themselves are just that, implementing regulations. When you do your comp plan, you set your policy base, and then when you do your zoning over time, you go back and you find the way to implement your policy base, and you can be challenged when the maps don't align. As noted on the maps here, there's been a healthy evolution of planning processes here in zoning. There are healthy evolution of zoning processes here in Bellingham. We're not changing the name of the town to zoning, not this week. Because we have a new logo. We wouldn't want to upset with the rollout of that. It would be too confusing. In 1967, there were visions that were crafted for Bellingham and to occur in 1985. It was one of the first instances of us looking forward as a community to identify where we hope to be. In the 1980s, there was a significant push that allowed for greater specificity at the neighborhood level, and to implement that in zoning. As a matter of fact, there were 21 plans done, and in that time, those plans were like mini zoning codes for each neighborhood, trying to find a way of balancing the aspirations and the needs to reflect local land use patterns. I should step back and say that most early zoning maps for virtually every community in America that uses zoning really reflected what was on the ground. They started with sort of, this is who we are, and then where do we go from there? And their evolution reflects changes in needs and changes in approaches over time as that moves forward. As I mentioned, we had the neighborhood plans in 2004. The zoning regs were separated and placed into the Bellingham Municipal Code, and that's probably appropriate considering our new relationship between the comp plan itself and sub-area plans and zoning to implement it from there. In doing that, the real key aspect of zoning now under GMA is to anticipate where growth will be directed and how it will be accommodated. And in doing that, you identify urban growth areas that are the areas that contain urban style development that are characterized by urban services and those other areas outside of the UGA. We identified those new neighborhoods that we anticipate providing accommodations for folks as they move here, as in-migration and expansion occur. We look to a certain amount of infill. There's always lands that are not fully developed or have potential for additional development where services are present. We see that as an opportunity. And like many of Western Washington communities, we've chosen to adopt an urban village strategy, which is to really concentrate growth with the provision of appropriate infrastructure and amenities. not just densifying for the sake of densifying to create a sense of place that works. And I'd say if we looked at, for example, Fairhaven and some of the emerging villages, both downtown and the Fountain District, we've seen, well, I say Berkeley for that matter too, significant success of placemaking, of creating a neighborhood, of really bolstering and infilling to achieve that and achieve higher density. So all of that goes into the land use map. You're required under growth management to have a FLUM. A FLUM stands for Future Land Use Map. And then your zoning map should look largely the same. And the purpose of the zoning map is over time that FLUM designations should convert into your zoning. You should rezone lands to match what your maps are and make them as close as possible. That's reflected in our local zoning. And local zoning contains a number of those specific use categories, which have both limitations on intensity and type of use and how they work throughout the city itself. And from that broad map, we mine down to the neighborhood level, where we have specific regulations and specific uses assigned to various areas. And this is a outcome of the neighborhood-based planning that really took down to the block by block level and came up with specific regulations. I should note that as we look to our commercial areas, as council members are aware, we are working to try to standardize some of our commercial standards, because if we have them appear in every one of the neighborhood plans and every one of the area with very slight discrepancy. You know, if the setback is 10 foot here and 11 foot there, we can make them all 10 or all 11. Seems like we can make it easier to apply broadly. And that's not uncommon to look for ways of consolidating and simplifying zoning, because it does tend to be fairly complex to determine. The question comes up is, should zoning change? I mean, should it evolve? Is it a line in the sand, or is it evolve with changing needs in the community? And we have agreed as a community that it should change. As a state, we've provided provisions in our municipal code that talk about the criteria you should use to evaluate zoning changes and to evaluate rezones for changed uses, because we acknowledge that we can't predict all of the futures that might occur and that we should find ways of doing it. However, changes can't be cavalier. They need to be based on a rational basis. They need to have a strong foundation that warrants them, and you need to build a compelling case that will address all of those rezone or changed changing municipal code circumstances to show how that might be. Things that typically happen is emerging community needs can result in additional changes. We might need, for example, greater multifamily opportunities than we have. We look for additional areas for it. That's perfectly reasonable. We might have goals in our comp plan that articulate some nuance about choices we might have in neighborhoods, or things we wish to achieve in commercial areas, or specific concerns we've got that we want to protect against, and we implement the comp plan. At the end of the day, we always measure whether the long-term interest is best served rather than short-term gain, and whether the community would benefit from that change. So the fundamental question is this good for Bellingham? Will this stand the test of time? Are we sacrificing a long-term future and long-term interest for some short-term gain, or does this fit in with a logical approach for us to deal with the future? And in any case, we assess every change we proceeding on, both environmentally. We do State Environmental Policy Act review of every proposed change and look at environmental impacts from it. And we also have to come back and come to the affirmative, if we approve it, that it would not adversely affect the public health, safety, and welfare. There has been some changes in the way we view zoning over time. Planning theory evolves, and that's because when you achieve ends and society changes, we need to find ways of being responsive going through it. While homogeneous zones do provide predictability, we often don't achieve other ends. So we find some ways of tailoring it, either through the creation of hybrid zones or other types of zones that allow for multiple uses in some area or different areas. Different zoning designations. That's ongoing, and that's happened as communities evolve over time, and pretty predictable in those processes to try to find the best fit. In the 1980s, folks were finding that some of the patterns, for example, that promoted suburbanization were contrary to the interest of promoting community. The classic example of the cul-de-sac communities where two houses shared a common property line, but you had to drive out of the development around the block and come in another entrance to be able to do it because there was no connection between successive plats. No one had a through road. While that may have worked for incremental development, it really didn't help us develop community. And a lot of focus has been placed on what really did work. What were the areas that seemed to have the best chance of success? What are the elements of success? And in terms of walkable, focused urban areas at the neighborhood level seem to be the ones we've been able to do best. They're the ones that are most resilient. And a lot of it is reinventing what was here in the past, because that was a traditional development pattern that was found in most communities over time. And the advent of expanded car ownership and the ability to commute further changed those patterns, and we lost it. We're looking to recreate that to some degree now. In addition, we've had a fundamental change in the housing environment we live in. Economics have changed significantly. And while much of our land use planning came from an environment where the residential use was the most dominant, and of those residential uses, the ones that were seen to contribute most to the community were single family, detached housing, that model is changing nationally. And that change reflects both economic realities of being able to afford it, environmental realities of being able to sustain it. It's expensive to have a dispersed low-density development, and also changing desires of a number of populations who are looking for something different. They're looking for more of that sense of community that might come from closer in or greater provision of amenities. Those demographics are found in changing house size, the fact that we have a significant cohort of folks, the boomers, are moving through, and they have changed expectations and desires of where they wish to live. In our community, students are a outlier in the sense compared to other communities similar to our size. We have a very significant student population, and that impacts of which are profound on the community because we've not accommodated the institutions of learning, not just Western, but nationwide, stopped building dorms a number of years ago and asked for surrounding communities to accommodate the student population, and that has an effect in terms of relatively in terms of planning. 4 years is pretty short time. That duration of folks cycling through is a limited period, but it does have an effect on housing stock and pricing and availability. Millennials, reflecting changed economics. Remember, wage growth has been fairly flat, but expenses for housing have been significant in their rise. Are looking for to adjust to that by saying, well, if we're going to get a different model, we want to have a model that's closer in, that's closer to amenities, that has greater sense of community, because we'll value that more at this point than other outcomes. The need to accommodate diversity. Again, zoning, unfortunately, the sad story of zoning is it has been exclusionary to its nature, and it has served to isolate pockets of poverty. And we need to find a way of changing diversity throughout the community to better balance the futures of those community members who live in poverty. There's a profound and statistically valid change for living in an area that's got mixed incomes compared to an area that's low income and homogeneous. So we need to encourage that if we have an investment for the future. As I mentioned, the hardship rates have not changed. We're above pre-recession levels. So in essence, if some will assert that what we're seeing in terms of the economy as a result of the recession, it's worse than before the recession. And that means the separation of those folks who have resources and those who don't, who are more challenged, is more profound. We have seen statewide and nationwide that children and young adults have a higher rates of deep poverty. And we see a change and skew in terms of the folks who have more resources tending to be older adults and seniors compared to those who are younger. On the average right now, 30% of the folks in Washington are struggling to make ends meet. So we have a duty to that portion of our community to find reasonable places for housing to occur. As I mentioned earlier, the housing paradigm has changed dramatically too. Single-family homes were a preferred outcome, and for many it still is. We're not going to dissuade anyone of that, and that's certainly a choice folks can have. Our plan does call for a significant number of single-family homes to be built. The balance for that is for those who don't see that as an ultimate end. We need to make sure we have adequate population, and it's not just providing it, because right now we can provide multifamily choices over time to accommodate others in our community and all incomes. It's where they're provided. That's become more of an issue now. Can we look to see if we can find them closer to services, closer and integrated to other populations, looking, as Steve Clark said, to schools to see if we can find more balance in our school populations itself. So in looking at expanding the housing choice, there's no silver bullet. There's no one singular change that's going to solve this. Cities are extraordinarily complex, and we play a significant role by being regulators and conveners, by setting policy, by zoning land and providing an adequate supply of land to do things, but we're not the folks who ultimately build units except for those special populations, protected populations we serve through our levy. And we do a darn good job for community our size in doing that. So we need to sort of understand how we fit in and encourage others to be participants to achieve an end. The strategies we have underway is we have an infill housing toolkit. It takes a number of portions of our city and it looks to find ways of providing housing choice there at a variety of price points. We have a ADU ordinance update that's moving its way through the Planning Commission, and its intent is to evaluate some changes to where those uses might be allowed either in a pilot program or outright. We have a subdivision ordinance which has broader support to look to say, can we from the get-go design newer areas as they develop to provide more housing choice and do it in a less cumbersome way. And we do that through lot size and ownership patterns and some infrastructure requirements. We have a series of incentives that certainly encourage the provision of affordable and subsidized housing, but also encourage, for example, the multifamily tax exemption and others, encourage and direct us to try to get some growth in our urban villages. The incentives also include dollar-based incentives in 2 of our urban villages, per se, to try to encourage the jumpstart of some development. We have gone to lean permitting. I'm proud to say if you were in King County and you brought a single-family home in to get a permit done, I think it's 6 months right now to go through the full review of that permit. That's a pretty average home with not much constraints. If you came to our counter here at the Permit Center in the city of Bellingham and you had a pretty average home with no constraints, it's 1 week. So the regulatory roadblocks for those kind of development have been vastly reduced in the idea of trying to say, let's not be the issue in restricting units hitting the ground. And finally, we're working really hard on the town gown program through a variety of factors to try to deal with the nuisance-based issues that tend to be characterized by the friction, by having a significant college population for our 3 large schools throughout the region. So in a nutshell, that sort of brings us back to today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Rick. Marie, you want to turn the lights back on? Council, any questions? Dan?
Thank you for the presentation this morning. Rick, I wanted to ask you about incentives for building. Would those include SDC reductions and impact fee reductions? Is that
yes, for qualifying projects, and typically we're allowed by state law to deal with those kind of reductions for those who are true affordable housing or subsidized housing. Senior housing is another one that could qualify.
Would that include urban village incentives? Or
we
no?
have a separate, we can do some incentives for urban village, but the ones that are flexible for us tend to be like parks fees and other fees. Those are policy based. But we also have incentive dollars that have been provided to try to jumpstart some of the areas that are a little more dormant, key project kind of things. It's difficult to incentivize because often if it's just market rate that's incentivized, you're burdening, for example, if you required some contribution to it, you're burdening one group to benefit another group. We've looked at a full range of tools to try to do it. We will certainly revisit those too. I think that's periodically you have to look and say, have we had success and have we achieved an end on that? For example, the multifamily tax credit really has been a significant incentive and has promoted development in our key areas. 46% of all of our new units, have been in the urban villages, and having that established is, I think, direct and causal. So are you looking to see if we're going to go more towards sort of raising the bar to market rate or types?
Well, yeah, I'm trying to get to exactly your point about incentivizing one group over another to have development located in certain areas of the city. So, and I'm familiar with that stat, the 46%. I think a lot of that's been downtown. We've seen a lot of growth in condo development downtown. Some of that's been in Barclay as well. But we're not seeing that in other areas. So, for example, Old Town, we're not really seeing anything there. In the Fountain District, I don't, other than the townhomes that went in on Peabody, I don't know what else we're seeing in those particular examples.
We'd like to come back at some future meeting and share with you an update we just did for staff on all the urban villages. We have a unique perspective in the sense that we see the pre-apps and we see the permits before the building actually construct. And on DuPont, we'll have, it appears, 3 multifamily, 1 completed, 1 under construction, and a 3rd one coming in. So that's significant. That's in the Fountain Village, urban village. So we're seeing some focused growth, but we are also seeing some challenges. It's hard to take Samish Way and jumpstart that. It may rely on the Housing Authority project, and now it's been delayed a bit to come in and do it. But I think that's a great discussion to talk about, and then talk about what can we do to make the targeted ones happen faster, because I think it's a different set for each one.
Mayor, you had something? No. Okay. Oh, okay. Anything? Okay. Okay, hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right. Ishbel? Go ahead.
Thank you, Councilmember Knudsen, and everyone here this morning. I apologize for being late. I had to deal with a bank fraud issue. Apparently someone's been trying to use my credit card, so I had to kind of take care of that before I drove up from Seattle. Is this loud enough for... Oh, that's okay. All right. Thank you. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here this morning. Bellingham is near and dear to my heart. All 4 of my children attended university, Western Washington University or Fairhaven or Woodring College of Education or one part or another of the complex here. So I've been to Bellingham for many dinners, many overnight stays, and we actually have a house over on Lummi Island, so I'm driving up and down the I-5 corridor a lot. I have been working with manufactured homeowners for 30 years. I started out collecting signatures to protect a manufactured housing community near the church that I used to attend in Seattle. I then became a community organizer and ultimately went to law school specifically to get my law degree to be an advocate for people who own their homes but who rent the land under them and are really the most vulnerable homeowners in the country, because when that land is gone, so is the value of their home. And so I worked in Seattle for a while. I was a fellow after University of Washington School of Law, working at Columbia Legal Services, and then became a staff attorney there. And then in 2006, somewhere back then, I became the executive director of the National Manufactured Homeowners Association, so expanded the work that I'd been doing in Washington all across the country. Retired from that position a year ago, hoping to retire, but when you've been doing something for 30 years that you're passionate about, you can't just walk away from it and eat bonbons and watch soap operas. So I've just got my own small consulting business now, and I consult with the Association of Manufactured Homeowners, which is a state association in Washington State, and I also have a contract actually with the city of Boulder in Colorado, a city that cares about manufactured homeowners and has contracted with me to help preserve the communities and work with the homeowners there, because they fully acknowledge that manufactured housing is very much part of the continuum of the affordable housing solution, and they want to do what they can in Boulder to preserve what they have. So the Association of Manufactured Homeowners is a statewide association. There's some people in the room here that I recognized when I came in who are members of AMO, and indeed we've met with several people here already in the past. I mean, I think it was about 4 years ago probably, to talk with you about zoning, and so it's nice to kind of come back and be here again and to see that maybe there's an opportunity for further discussions and perhaps some action on the item now. There are, 10 manufactured housing communities within the city of Bellingham providing space for, I don't know exact the number, but between 800 and 900 households. I think it's about 3% of the housing within the city of Bellingham, but about 13% of the housing within the urban growth area. So a significant number of housing. Some of them are for seniors, some are for families. And that's the beauty of manufactured homes, that they are affordable for young families just starting out on the homeownership ladder. And they're also an attractive option for seniors whose families have grown up and left the house, whose spouses or partners may have passed on and who still want to live independently in their own homes. So that it offers an attractive housing opportunity for a range of households, a range of incomes. And I think that's one of the joys of manufactured housing community living, is that sense of community, that people really do come together and help each other out. Things that you can't quantify or qualify in terms of social services that they provide for each other, things that otherwise social service providers or the city itself would have to provide, rides to the doctors, picking up the groceries when you're infirm and housebound for a while, and just the general sense of being and having neighbors that you can talk with. You don't often always get that in apartment buildings or even on streets of single-family homes. So there's a real sense of connection and community that is obviously lost when communities are destroyed, which is what happens sometimes, and more when land becomes, rare and necessary apparently for other purposes like Walmart's or Costco's. Manufactured homeowners in this state have some rights. There is a state law, RCW 5920, that provides, that they have to have a 1-year lease, that the landlord has to give them 3 months' notice before the rent is raised, that if the community is closing or changing its use, the landlord has to give 12 months' notice. We're trying to change some of those laws at the state level to give homeowners more protections, because 12 months isn't enough time. I know it may sound a lot when you've got plans and you know exactly what you're doing with your life, but when your plan was to stay put in your own home for the rest of your life, then being told you only have 12 months to get out of your own home is devastating, particularly for seniors. And I have heard anecdotally from senior service providers that the health and well-being of seniors in those situations deteriorates quite rapidly. So anything we can do to preserve that housing and allow people to age in place, as they say, is certainly to benefit to the city and to the community as a whole. We're trying to get 3 years notice of closure at the state level. We got it out of the House of Representatives last year at 18 months, so only an additional 6 months. But it's always a struggle working with the legislature, because the community owners themselves are a very strong lobby. They have paid lobbyists and paid advocates, and so homeowners have only their own voice, which they bring fervently, but sometimes it's not enough to convince the state that things need to change. But we keep doing that, which is why coming at the local level is so refreshingly more of an opportunity for us, since I think at the local level things can be done and have been done. In Washington State, there are several jurisdictions that have already enacted manufactured mobile home park zones. I've worked with the city of Tumwater, the city of Linwood, the city of Marysville, the city of Spokane, and Snohomish County, at least those 5, on their zoning ordinances. The first was the city of Tumwater way back in 2008. They decided that they would implement a mobile home park zone in the city of Tumwater. They had 10 communities. They would zone 7 of them as mobile home park zones. One was in a very busy commercial area right by a garage, and they didn't think that was necessarily one that could be preserved, and the other 2 were so tiny that it would be insignificant to preserve them. The community owners challenged that ordinance, and it went all the way to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals, where the city prevailed. The Ninth Circuit en banc said, yes, the city can do that. Zoning is an entirely appropriate action for cities to take, upzoning or downzoning, and that the city was quite within its powers to do that. The community owners have never challenged any of the other zonings since that one was, since the court ruled in favor of the city of Tumwater. Tumwater, Linwood, and Snohomish County have specifically identified communities that are now zoned mobile home park. And to give you an example, the Snohomish County zoned, I think, 22 communities as mobile home parks within the county, preserving well over 2,000 households from fear of relocation or eviction. It doesn't solve the problem. I mean, there are ways, obviously, that a jurisdiction can revisit the issue. The park owner can come to the city council and argue that it's no longer economically viable for them to operate as a mobile home park, and the city council has that discretion to revisit the zoning and change it again. So there's always that out, which is an important out for a city council to have. You do want to make sure that all your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider zoning as an appropriate way to preserve and protect what you have. And I noticed that your chat recommendations from 2008, I don't know if they're still current, but way back then, preserving and protecting mobile homes was indeed one of your criteria, one of your priorities, because you acknowledge the need to preserve affordable, safe housing in your city. Zoning, in my mind, meets all of the criteria on page 12 of the PowerPoint. Thank you for providing that, because it meets the requirements of the Growth Management Act. It preserves existing neighborhoods. It provides a diversity of housing options. It addresses housing needs for all economic sectors of the population. And it's just, it just gives you another option beyond apartment renting and single-family home ownership. Now, there's manufactured housing as well, and more options is usually better. Preserving what you have is also cheaper than building new. So if you were to displace 900 households, where would they go? Onto Section 8 wait lists, into subsidized housing, where would they go? So if you've got what you have, then it's important to think about ways to protect it. And the nice thing about manufactured housing is that it continues to be a form of housing that is getting better and better in its production. You've got small, footprint homes that are incredibly energy efficient that can be bought for around $40,000. It's cheaper than building a similar sized home. And yeah, you've got the setup on the lot, but still, as manufactured housing evolves, I think so could manufactured housing communities. So older homes can be replaced with newer, energy efficient homes. And indeed, there's a representative, forgetting his name, from Minnesota, has a bill right now that would allow the federal government to replace older homes with new energy efficient homes with really good sort of purchase option for the homeowner. And Habitat for Humanity has done that. Various other nonprofits have done that. So allowing the park owner to continue to operate their very viable business, and it is a profitable business, while also allowing seniors, young families, people of color, veterans to stay in their own homes and build some equity in those homes, I think is something very much worth considering. And there are nonprofits out there that will purchase the land and preserve it as manufactured housing communities. Snohomish County Housing Authority has done that. King County Housing Authority has done that. The Low Income Housing Institute has done that. The Manufactured Housing Community Preservationists in King County has done that. And there's also an opportunity for resident ownership. There's a national organization, ROC USA, Resident Owned Communities USA, that has a local technical assistance provider in Washington State that has worked with communities in Buckley, in Pierce County, in Olympia, and over in Spokane and in Yakima, I believe, as well, to help the residents purchase the homes as co-ops. And so that's another way for them to build equity and be able to even sell homes to other, other people looking for affordable housing. So there's a whole variety of ways that once you preserve these communities, they can continue to add value to your overall housing affordability needs in the area. Linwood did try voluntary zoning for a while. They were a little hesitant to go straight to the mandatory zoning because they feared pushback from the community owners. So they thought, well, if we say if you remain, remain as a mobile home park for only 5 years, we'll just ask you for 5 years, then we'll give you incentives. I think it was breaks on property taxes and things like that, utility costs. And not one community owner in Linwood would even go with the voluntary zone. So the Linwood City Council said, well, okay, if you won't go voluntary, we'll have to make you do it. And so they enacted their mobile home park zone, and again, it was not challenged by the
Ms. Bell,
park.
can I ask you a question? When you say mobile home park, because I see down in Southern California and Arizona, you have mobile homes and manufactured homes in the same park.
Yes.
Is that what
Thank you for that clarification. I apologize. I usually always say manufactured housing, but it's such a mouthful, and I'm trying to get through a lot of stuff. So just to clarify, mobile homes were built before the HUD code went into effect on the 15th of June, 1976. And since then, they've been called manufactured homes, but they're interchangeable and they're different from modular homes. I'm not talking about modular homes. So manufactured homes, mobile homes, in my mind, they're all the same. And yes, I'd love it to be a manufactured housing community zone, but that's, I mean, there's so many syllables in there. So I just say mobile home park zone, but whichever. But thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
I've been on vacation. Does that include tiny houses? I mean, that's the new craze, is tiny houses, and I have people asking me, well, where in Bellingham could you put a tiny home? So do those fit in there?
They could. I don't see why they couldn't, because they're small footprints. So let's, for instance, say there was a small, older, single-sized mobile home. Let's say it was built in 1960, and for whatever reason, the owner was no longer there, and the family just didn't know what to do with the home. They could potentially, move it out. It would probably have to go to the dump or recycled, but it would probably be the community owners' authority as to whether a tiny home could come in on that space or not, because they're built differently, right? And they probably need more of a foundation. So I'm not sure that they're completely comparable, and I've not really done much work in the tiny home sector. So I guess I'm saying it depends.
Well, and they're mobile. Most of the time they're mobile, so they're on some
they're
kind
on
of
a trailer to come in, or a flatbed or something.
Yeah, and then you can just pull them out. I mean, they're...
Which is different from mobile homes and manufactured homes. They are not mobile. That mobile is a huge misnomer when you're talking about manufactured homes, because they really are meant to be set in place and not moved once they're set in place. It sounds like tiny homes are maybe a different animal altogether.
I think they're both.
Yeah.
Some are, but I've seen them in like settings where there's multiple tiny homes, and I don't know how that works. But I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's. You're right. I think that's part of the complexity and part of the opportunity going forward. Could you create a new tiny home village, for instance, for some group of people that appreciate that? Manufactured homes tend to be bigger than tiny homes. I mean, they're 3-bedroom, 2-bath is probably the standard size of a manufactured home. So they're, in that sense, they're more like a site-built ranch home or something. But I think the wave of the future are smaller and more energy efficient for everyone, and we have to be like that, I think, given the current situation. So I think that's not today's conversation, but I think it's worth thinking about going forward. Absolutely, yeah.
I don't want to cut you off, but I think April has a...
Well, I think within some of these mobile park zones, there's also recreation vehicle allotment in areas, and I think that's probably where the tiny home comes into that, because they are mobile. I do want to say, before we end up in public comment, I'm a product of somebody who had upward mobility because we had access to a mobile home park. My mom was actually able to move, and so ours was planted, and then we picked it up and moved it from one state to the other, and it provided a significant opportunity for lower housing costs, and then ability for me to be in club volleyball and everything else, get a scholarship, and move on to now being a single-family homeowner. And I know I appreciated the zoning conversation because manufactured mobile homes have been through that too. We're a generational family of that. I'm the 3rd generation that lived in a mobile home park because that's what we knew and that's what we could do. My grandparents were not subsidized, and they did have a significant community. And when you think about some of the subsidized housing that we have in that community that they provide, I think you're exactly right that these are, and it's it's referenced over and over again that these are our largest amount of that little a affordable housing of people who are not subsidized. They might be getting some federal help, whether it be Social Security or other things, but these are just naturally places to go. And I will say in Bellingham, because I don't think we've really cracked that nut of how do you get out of that multifamily, large apartment complex with your family and then jump into a single family home. We have a lot of work to do to figure out how somebody can stage that upward mobility. Right now, that next step are the very few mobile home courts that we have. And I'll have students that come and they're so excited because they're finally getting out of an apartment and they're going to have a place where they can have 2 little chickens. And, you know, from somebody looking from a middle class success perspective, you know, they might naysay that, but that's a really big opportunity for a family to feel more secure. And I look at some of our parks, and some of them we have over 100 students in there, and they're one step away from homelessness. And so I think as we see these pressures coming currently, I do think it's a really valid and important conversation for us to have is how are we going to preserve and maintain? And then also, many of these communities are very stressed, very traumatized, and whenever you're living in a state of constant worry, thinking like, okay, I just heard of another one closing, regardless if it's in your community, that's more trauma that we're putting on people who are already highly impacted. So I do appreciate you coming and having the conversation. I think it would be interesting to continue it on what is the zoning currently. I know currently we have single family and multifamily. We have one that's community owned. That's the James Street one. And what is the precariousness of those? And is there something that we can do in the meantime to help with that? Because the next step is subsidized, and then how are we going to handle that? So,
interim steps like they did in Snohomish County was they introduced a moratorium so that no communities could close or be developed while the city council went through a very strenuous proposal, and they extended the moratorium twice, so that it ended up being an 18-month moratorium, and then the county council in Snohomish County unanimously passed the mobile home park zone that they had there. And speaking of upward mobility, Hilary Swank, famous star of stage and screen, lived in a mobile home park in Whatcom County growing up. Yeah, so
Okay,
I'm happy to leave it for
thank you very much. I'm going to now open it up for public comment. Anybody that wants to come down, please line up over here and be as brief as you can, and we'll go for another 15 minutes.
Hello there. My name is Charlene McKenzie, and I live in Bellingham in a manufactured home court. However, the Postal Service still says trailer number 9. It will be a nice day when that kind of misnomer is corrected. I want to speak to you about my own experience and those few that I know, since people in mobile home parks, different mobile home parks, are not in touch with each other. There is no community that way. The bottom line is we're all at risk, and as you said, April, we feel it. The fact that a landlord, most of which are absentee, and we don't know them, never see them, can sell the land out from under the homes we own is definitely distressing. Mobile homes, manufactured homes, don't move. It's a misnomer to say that we can take our homes with us. But when a mobile home court is sold, and we have this 18-month period to find a place to live, we are really between a rock and a hard place. Where we have to take our residents with us. But where do we take it? There is no place open to my knowledge, in our city to go to another mobile home court. Our homes, while they can be very well maintained, still, as a double wide in which I live, moving that would be very costly, prohibitively. I understand there is no more state funds to subsidize us and help us move, and with no place to go, that makes it pretty hard. In addition, many of us who are senior citizens would find it very hard on us, physically, mentally, financially, to move. So we really are in a tough place. People who think that, well, we'll just leave and leave their residents behind have said these things, but for many of us, that's the major investment that we have. So we lose our shirts, and we're already on fixed incomes and facing financial stress.
Thank you very much. We need to go to the next speaker. You have 3 minutes. I should have said that at the beginning. So.
Then, since I didn't get warned, could I say one more thing?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. We really are powerless. We look to the City Council to consider us, to come visit us, and see for yourselves the position that we're in. And we are hoping that perhaps we might be included in some form later in the rental registration and safety inspection program, because it does a lot for us over which we have no control, including increased rent and safety and health issues.
Thank you very much. Patrick, you want to come in?
Patrick McCree, Grant Street in Bellingham. If the city somehow finds a way to build affordable housing here in Bellingham, there is an inexhaustible supply of people from all over the country who would like to come here and be housed in that affordable housing. I think the city needs to find a way to direct its affordable housing at residents of Bellingham who are in need of it, who are low-income people and need affordable housing. And I'll give an example of that. The Aloha property on Samish Way, which is going to be developed by the Bellingham Housing Authority. If the Housing Authority adopt what is called a local preference in establishing their waiting lists, residents of Bellingham would go right to the front of that list for the available units. It's completely legal. It's permitted by HUD. That's the kind of program that I think we need to actually solve the affordable housing problem for people in Bellingham. And I think the city can also do something similar. The city can build unsubsidized public housing, and because the city can borrow money more cheaply and the city does not expect a profit from this housing, the rents in this unsubsidized housing built in urban villages would be lower for people and more affordable for people and could be directed to city residents. So I think you need to figure out a way to direct affordable housing to the problem here in Bellingham for Bellingham residents that need this type of housing. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Next.
Andronetta Douglas. I live in Bellingham, and I'm precinct captain in precinct 204. So I have been to the mobile home park that's off Eliza. That is a wonderful community. People help each other out quite a lot there. There's a large South Asian community. Many of them are language challenged. And because they are interdependent, and they're all ages, including retired, they help each other. And just the thought of trying to have those people move would fracture a lot of those families, would really disable the safety net that they've established for themselves. So I encourage you to help preserve those people in the safe place that they've created for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, ma'am.
My name's Gretchen Harsh, and I live in the same manufactured home park as Charlene was speaking to. I just wanted to tell my experience. A year and a half ago, I found that I was having a different mobility situation existed for myself, so I was wondering whether I could maintain my manufactured home, which is a double wide, and so thought I should think of downsizing and that I would rent. So for a year and a half, I looked for rental property with a maximum amount of $1,000, which would include the minimum utilities. And I looked also in retirement facilities, not assisted living, non-assisted living retirement facilities. What happened was I couldn't find anything. I wanted to be where I could be close to where my spiritual practice is and the food co-op and the Y, where I could get exercise. Wouldn't have to use a car, but would have bus available and that sort of thing. It's not out there. So I'm very much for whatever we can do here in Bellingham to help keep manufactured homes available. And just recently, one last comment was, I did check to see with the new senior affordable housing that's just being completed, I do qualify in one category, and when I came home and figured out what my rent is in the park plus my utilities, it's cheaper for me to stay where I'm at than to move to that facility. So thank you for letting me speak.
Thank you. Go ahead, Paul. This will be our last speaker. I'm sure we'll be having more conversations about this topic. Go ahead, Paul.
Thank you. Paul Chasseur, I've lived and worked in Bellingham for a long time, and I just want to say thank you for spending your time on this topic and for this whole series of meetings. It seems to me that cities are always looking for what can we do, what else can we do in addition to what we're already doing. And so this, I think, is a golden opportunity to protect, looks like well over 1,000 homes that are relatively affordable. I would encourage you to take a close look at the moratorium and then an ordinance that does. I wanted to also say that these parks are usually pretty healthy economically for the owner. And so it is a good, viable business, and many of them will probably stay in that business. But if and when they ever want to leave the business, I would hope that the community, together with the city and others, could help to capture that land and then keep it affordable. So, as Ishbel mentioned, this code change would always allow the city an out to rezone back to something else later, but it also gives the owner of the property an out to continue the business they're in, or if they ever want to get out of the business, they can sell it for probably, whatever the market will bear, which is based on pretty healthy revenues usually from all the renters in the park. So I think everybody wins in that case if land can be, as it has been elsewhere, converted to permanently affordable land for the residents and homeowners in the park. And now with Washington State Housing Finance Commission offering to provide some of the financing to make it possible to keep the land rents relatively affordable and to provide the security that most current tenants don't have in those parks. So I think it's a winner all around if you can find time to work on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Anything else from the committee? Go ahead.
I just think we, in thinking about next steps, we've had, what's that? Did somebody else want to speak?
Oh, go ahead. One more person.
No long observation. I'd just like to know if I can submit written
Oh,
information.
sure. Yes, no problem, sir. We always take that.
And your address is downstairs, or just the city hall?
Are you talking about a letter or email?
Yeah.
210 Lottie Street, Bellingham City Council, 210 Lottie Street, Bellingham, Washington. April.
So just thinking of next steps for this committee, I think this is the third or fourth in the affordable housing series. I was able to look at our comprehensive plan, and I see that a lot of the things that we've talked about, that integrated community, that supporting economically, sustainability, and then, of course, preserving and protecting these unsubsidized housings, as well as addressing diverse housing needs, so what we talked about with the school district. I mean, we have all those policies. They're there. You can find them. I think for me, the question is, for staff, what of these policies that we have in our comp plan that are there, but they're not necessarily things that we put to the forefront that we could potentially look at speeding up to allow for us to meet these goals that we've recognized inside of this committee. And I'm wondering if that wouldn't be a good next step, is to have staff come back with what are those policies that are supporting these things that we've talked about environmentally, socially, economically, and then address this affordable housing, the unsubsidized affordable housing especially, and then maybe have a conversation with this group on what do we think the council could actually support and we could ask the council to take forward. Are we feeling like we're there at this point, or do we want to have more conversations with a different group? That's my question, just as far as direction.
May I?
Sure.
I think that having staff come back with those with that information is fine. I guess I'm thinking a few steps past that, and that would be perhaps working with organizations like Cultion CLT or Mercy Housing Northwest to be prepared for closures or sales of parks that are housing these individuals, these families. And I'd want to understand what the city's relationship with those community housing development organizations could be to be poised to protect those parks should they be sold. And the one that comes to mind is the one off of Telegraph Road, which was sold and then sat vacant for years, and then now is a senior housing facility, but a different type. So to prevent that type of situation, what could we do as a city, and what could Cultion CLT, if they are prepared to undertake that, or Mercy Housing Northwest, what could that look like, and what would the steps be to take that? And I do support your next steps.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to make sure those are certainly that we're talking about, but then all those other housing forms we talked about as well. So it's just to clarify.
Yes.
When the council members are done.
They're done.
Okay. So I have a procedural issue, so that's me. I support this, so I know that we've talked a little bit about having moratoriums to protect people's housing as it exists now. We're going through our budgeting process and reprioritizing our work plans. So I guess my request to you would be, there are options we have available to make sure we don't lose the housing we have. And then when we go through the budgeting process, we like Rick is the prime example of having the list with the next thing on it. And if this is more important than something else, then we can allocate the time and the staff time to do this. But I'd like to think that we're reprioritizing this as something that's very important, rather than just adding it on to a list that each department head is now keeping as the things come out of council. So can I request that we consider having this both an action taken to preserve the housing and then a process by which we prioritize that this is what we want our staff to be working on.
Go ahead.
Just to clarify, there's two things going on right here, I think, that we're talking about, and one is the potential of a moratorium that we could move on a lot faster than what this committee is currently working at, and then the other is that so that would be a separate action maybe from this committee to come to the full council, and then the other is all these things that we've talked about, this diversification of housing, this need for upward mobility, this integration of communities. That, I think, is that next step in this group to say, what are those things that we already have the policies for, what is the viability of them, and then for us to determine what we want to push to the forefront.
And
so
I'm asking you to do that during the budgeting, work plan, reassessment process, so that we're very clear that we're prioritizing this, and when staff isn't doing something else that's being asked for, that we've made that decision, which I think that housing is obviously extremely important. It's you know, what I'm focused on every day. So anyway, that's all
Okay.
I ask. And then that allows us to come forward with a thoughtful, this is how it's going to work. And okay, that's my direction for them.
Go ahead, Rick.
So, as I understand it, you've separated the issue and separated the matter. And one issue, which is a component part, is how does Bellingham address current manufactured and mobile home parks? What is the risk of conversion? What are the protections that are in place in our zoning? Before we jump to a moratorium to solve a problem, let's hear what we're doing now and assess if it could be done, if we have adequate protections or we need additional protections. And staff will be happy to come forward in 2 weeks and discuss that with you. So I think that'll have its own track because we still have some fact-finding to do about what we have to tweak in order to provide maximum protection, if any. The second component part is you've asked us to say, in the toolbox, the suite of things we're doing, are there things that might get greater traction sooner to achieve some of the ends? And we could come back and discuss with you some of the pros and cons on those different options so that you could frame what work program changes you wish to make during the budget program.
Okay. Okay, I want to thank Ishbel for coming up here and
And
Rick
the
for your
community.
presentation, everybody for coming. Meeting is adjourned.